Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting collection of sources from you this time, all focusing on battery energy storage systems, BES.
Yeah, a lot to dig into. Market forecasts, technology challenges, key companies. It's all in there.
It really is. So our mission today, as always, is to pull out the most crucial insights from everything you sent. We want to give everyone a clear, engaging handle on BS and why it's such a critical piece of the energy landscape right now.
Exactly. Often called the missing piece in the renewables puzzle. Right. Because it tackles that core problem of intermittency with solar and wind.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Looking through these sources, it's clear BS isn't just some, niche tech. It's tied directly to this global push for net zero.
Absolutely. You've got the COP28 agreement aiming to triple renewables by 2030.
Right, and the UN goal slashing emissions 45% by 2030, net zero by 2050. Those are massive targets.
They are. And why BES is so vital comes down to the nature of renewables. Solar and wind, they're variable, aren't they?
The wind doesn't always blow, sun's not always out.
Precisely. And our grid, it wasn't really built for that kind of fluctuation. It prefers consistency.
So BSS acts like a buffer.
Kind of, yeah. It's like storing daylight to use at night. A reserve tank, you could say, for when the main supply is unpredictable. It smooths things out.
Got it. But it does more than just store energy for later, right? The sources mention other key functions.
Oh, definitely. That's a key point.
Yeah.
Storing energy is one thing, improving overall grid reliability, but it's also about stability.
Stability, how so?
Through something called frequency regulation. Imagine the grid needs to operate at a very specific frequency, like 50 or 60 hertz.
Okay.
When big loads switch on or off, or when a cloud covers a solar farm, that frequency can wobble. BESS can react almost instantly, injecting or absorbing power to keep that frequency stable. It's like a shock absorber.
Okay. That makes sense, especially with more variable renewables coming online.
Exactly. Then there's capacity or peak load shaving.
Right, avoiding firing up those expensive, often dirtier peaker plants during high demand.
You got it. Use the stored battery power instead. Cheaper, cleaner.
And the sources mention transmission and distribution too, delaying upgrades.
Yeah, potentially. If you have storage placed strategically, you might be able to defer or maybe even avoid building massive new power lines, which is incredibly expensive and time-consuming.
Okay, interesting. And then there's the backup power aspect.
Crucial. For hospitals, data centers, places where the power absolutely cannot go out. BESS provides that immediate backup. Indispensable, really.
So the need is clearly there, and it seems multifaceted. What about the market? Is it actually growing to meet this need?
Oh, absolutely. The projections are, frankly, huge. Bloomberg DNEF sees a CAGR that's compound annual growth rate over 21% from now to 2030.
Wow. Over 21% yearly growth.
Yep, reaching at least 520 gigawatt hours of capacity by 2030. And McKinsey's even more bullish, talking about potential investment hitting like $150 billion.
That's serious money, serious capacity. It shows real conviction, doesn't it?
It really does. It signals that BESS isn't just seen as helpful, but fundamental to the future grid.
And where is this growth happening? Is it evenly spread?
Not quite. Asia's expected to lead the pack, maybe hitting 46% of global installations by 2030.
Okay.
But interestingly, North America is adopting BESS really quickly relative to its renewable build-out. They seem very focused on tackling that intermittency issue directly.
And Europe.
Europe's following, and, the EU's clean industrial deal could give it a real push, more supportive policies, maybe faster permitting.
Right. And just to put the scale in perspective, the IEA numbers.
Yeah, the International Energy Agency.
Yeah.
They project renewables jumping from about 4,200 gigawatts in 2023 to potentially 10,000 gigawatts by 2030.
10,000. That's
Yeah.
a lot of solar panels and wind turbines.
It is. And all that variable power needs a home when it's generated, but not immediately needed. I mean, storage. Lots of storage.
Okay, so the outlook is strong, but it can't all be smooth sailing. The sources flag challenges, especially around raw materials.
Yeah, this is a really big one. Building all these batteries takes, a lot of specific stuff. Lithium, cobalt, nickel are the big ones people talk about. But also manganese, aluminum, copper, graphite. Even things like vanadium and lead are in some battery types.
And the problem is where we get them from.
Exactly. Both the EU and the US are, let's say, heavily reliant on just a few countries for many of these critical materials. That creates real supply chain vulnerabilities.
Geopolitical risks, basically.
Yes, and just general supply disruption risks. So diversification is key. Finding more sources, different sources.
And governments are trying to address this. You mentioned legislation.
They are. The EU has its Critical Raw Material Act, the CRMA, and the U.S. has provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, focusing on metals important for future technologies, or MIFTs.
Yep.
A major factor driving this is China's dominance, particularly in processing. They refine something like 70% of the world's lithium, and they lead in actual battery manufacturing, too.
So that concentration is a concern.
It is, and there are real questions about future supply. McKinsey, for instance, suggested we might even face a lithium shortage by 2030.
A shortage, wow.
And remember, when the DRC temporarily banned cobalt exports, that kind of thing shows how fragile the supply can be.
So what are the specific goals of something like the EU's CRMA?
They've set targets for 2030. Things like extracting 10% of their needs domestically, processing 40% domestically, and recycling 25% domestically.
That processing target seems significant.
It is. And importantly, they also aim to rely on no single third country for more than 65% of any strategic raw material, reducing that dependency.
Okay, that 25% recycling target naturally leads us to the next point. Battery recycling itself seems crucial.
Absolutely crucial, both for sustainability dealing with waste and for economics. Getting those valuable materials back reduces the pressure on mining new ones.
And where does recycling capacity stand now?
Well, currently, a lot of the existing lithium recycling capability is actually in China.
Ah, so again, a push for domestic capacity elsewhere.
Exactly. The EU and US are definitely trying to build up their own recycling infrastructure.
What are the main ways they actually recycle these batteries?
There are two main routes. Pyrometallurgy, basically using high heat, melting things down.
Okay.
And hydrometallurgy, using chemical solutions, acids usually, to dissolve and separate out the valuable metals.
Which metals are they mainly trying to recover?
The big ones are nickel and cobalt, especially from NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistries, which are common, and lithium, of course, which is key for LFP, lithium iron phosphate batteries, too.
And regulations are pushing this along. The EU battery regulation sounds quite detailed.
It really is. Came into force in 2023. It sets specific recovery targets. For lithium, it's 50% recovery by the end of 2027, jumping to 80% by 2031.
That's ambitious.
It is. And even higher for cobalt, copper, lead, and nickel, 90% recovery by end of 2027, then 95% by 2031. Plus, it mandates minimum amounts of recycled content in new industrial batteries starting from 2031. So it creates a market for the recycled materials.
Creating that circular economy loop.
That's the idea. And the US EPA is working on guidance too, expected mid-2025.
Okay, now, before recycling, there's this idea of second life batteries, especially from EVs. Tell us about that.
Right. This is a fascinating area. An electric car battery, once it degrades maybe down to, say, 70% or 80% of its original capacity, its state of health or its OH might not be great for the car anymore. Doesn't give enough range or power.
Sure.
But it still holds a lot of energy. It could be perfectly suitable for a less demanding job, like stationary storage in a BESS system.
So you take the old EV battery pack and just plug it into the grid somehow.
Essentially, yes. After some refurbishment and integration, it gets a second life doing grid storage, maybe until its capacity drops further, perhaps to around 50% OH.
What are the benefits? Cost?
Cost is a big one.
Potentially.
Using a second life battery could be cheaper than a brand new one. And environmental benefits, too. You're extending the useful life of the battery before it needs energy-intensive recycling.
So it's a trade-off then. Reuse versus immediate recycling.
Exactly. It's a debate. And the best option depends on a few things. How scarce and expensive are the raw materials? If lithium prices are sky high, maybe recycling makes more sense sooner to recover it.
Right.
But if materials are cheaper, or if the technology for reuse is really efficient and safe, then second life looks more attractive. Economics and technology availability really drive that decision.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the need, the market growth, the material, and end-of-life issues.
Yeah.
Who are the actual companies building and deploying all this BESS capacity? Is it fragmented or concentrated?
It's actually quite concentrated at the top. The sources say the top 10 companies control something like 61% of the global BESS capacity.
61%, just 10 companies.
Yep. And interestingly, 6 of those top 10 are publicly listed companies. Gives you an idea of the scale required.
Can you name some of the big players the sources mention, based on deployed capacity?
Sure. Looking at listed companies, Tesla from the US is definitely a major player. But leading in terms of sheer manufacturing capacity and deployment right now are Chinese companies, particularly CATL, Contemporary Amperex Technology, and BYD.
CATL and BYD, right. We hear those names a lot with EV batteries, too.
Exactly. There's huge overlap. Others mentioned with significant capacity include Eve Energy, also from China, Canadian Solar.
Canadian Solar, interesting. A solar panel company moving into storage.
Makes sense, right? Offering integrated solutions. And then you have LG Chem from South Korea, Zhejiang Nerada Power Source from China, Siemens Energy from Germany.
Siemens, a big industrial name.
Yep. Wärtsilä from Finland. They're big in power plants and grid solutions. And another Chinese firm, Guangzhou, Great Power Energy and Technology.
So a definite strong showing from Chinese companies, but players from the U.S., Canada, South Korea, Germany, Finland, too.
Right. But overall, China's manufacturing scale is currently dominant. Though it's a dynamic field, the sources noted like 2,600 projects globally as of early 2025, involving over 300 companies.
So lots of activity, even if concentrated at the very top.
Definitely. And 177 companies had at least 2 projects, showing some level of established presence.
Okay. Now, government support must be playing a huge role in all this growth.
Absolutely essential.
Hmm.
We mentioned the EU Clean Industrial Deal. That's about reinforcing their commitment, trying to speed things up with legislation, financial incentives, maybe faster permitting for projects.
Building on their Net Zero Industry Act.
Exactly. It's trying to create a more supportive ecosystem for clean tech, including BESS.
And in the U.S., we mentioned the IRA.
Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act has been a game changer. Big subsidies for domestic battery production. It's driven a wave of investment announcements in the U.S.
How do the U.S. and EU approaches compare?
Well, one point made in the sources is about speed and access. The U.S. IRA incentives have generally been seen as quicker and maybe easier to access for companies.
Simpler framework?
Perhaps. The EU system can be more complex, though the Clean Industrial Deal is partly an attempt to streamline things and catch up in terms of attractiveness for investment.
Are other regions doing similar things?
Oh, yes. China has its 5-year plans, which heavily support strategic industries like batteries. Japan has its Green Transformation GX strategy. India has its production-linked incentive PLI scheme. Everyone wants a piece of this.
And does this support impact the actual cost of batteries in different regions?
It does seem to. The IRA subsidies are apparently helping U.S. battery production costs get closer to Chinese levels, achieving near parity within the U.S. market.
Whereas EU costs are still higher.
Currently, yes.
Yeah.
That's one reason the EU is keen to boost its own manufacturing and reduce reliance on imports.
Okay, policy is key. What about technology? Are we just talking lithium-ion or are other things emerging?
Lithium-ion is dominant for sure, leveraging all that EV scale. But other technologies are definitely getting attention. Sodium-ion is probably the most talked about right now.
Sodium-ion, why the excitement there?
Mainly because sodium is incredibly abundant and cheap compared to lithium. Think table salt.
Right, much more common.
Exactly. And potentially some safety advantages. They might not pack as much energy in the same space as lithium-ion lower energy density.
But for stationary storage, space isn't always the absolute top priority, like in a car.
Precisely. For BSS, cost and safety can be bigger drivers. The main hurdle for sodium-ion right now is scaling up manufacturing to bring costs down. But the potential is there.
Interesting. Any other chemistries or tech mentioned?
Yeah, the sources briefly touch on others. Older tech like lead acid still has niche uses. Then there are flow batteries, solid state, that's the big hope for EVs too, different nickel-based chemistries.
Flow batteries, those use liquid electrolytes, right?
Right. And even non-battery storage, like gravity storage systems or thermal energy storage. Lots of innovation happening, trying to find the best solutions for different needs.
Okay, good to know alternatives are being explored. But sticking with batteries for now costs, you mentioned policy impacts, but what's the overall trend?
Definitely downwards, which is great news for deployment.
What's driving that?
Several things. The massive scale-up of EV battery production brings costs down for everyone. Raw material prices like lithium have actually fallen significantly from recent peaks. And just general manufacturing efficiencies and technology improvements.
Any specific numbers on the price drops?
Yeah, Bloomberg NEF noted a pretty sharp drop in 2024, something like 40%. From around $275 per kilowatt hour down to maybe $165.
40% in 1 year. That's huge.
It is. And they expect that trend to continue. Maybe another 40% drop by 2030 compared to 2023 levels, and over 50% by 2035.
So getting much cheaper. But is it cheap enough yet to compete everywhere?
Getting there. Solar combined with 4 hours of battery storage is becoming cost competitive in many places, around $85 per megawatt hour according to one source.
Okay, that sounds competitive with gas peakers, maybe?
Yeah, but longer duration storage, say 8 hours, is still generally more expensive than running a natural gas plant, maybe around $105 per megawatt for the storage option. So further cost reductions are needed, especially for that longer duration storage, to fully displace fossil fuels across the board.
One potential wrinkle, though, you mentioned U.S. tariffs.
Right. If the U.S. imposes significant tariffs on imported batteries, particularly from China, that could certainly push up costs within the U.S. market and slow down that downward price trend locally. Something to watch.
Okay. Finally, let's touch on ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors. It's not just about clean energy output, is it?
Not at all. This is really critical. McKinsey apparently identified something like 21 distinct ESG risks across the whole battery value chain.
21. Like what?
Well, environmental risks, emissions from mining and processing, water use, pollution, impact on biodiversity,
Okay.
social risks, worker health and safety, particularly in mining,
Oh, yeah.
labor rights, impact on local communities, indigenous rights where mining occurs.
Right. We hear about issues with cobalt mining, for example.
Exactly. And governance risks, things like potential corruption, conflicts of interest, managing the supply chain responsibly, transparency.
Yeah.
Ensuring ethical sourcing is a huge governance challenge.
And that ties back into the sovereignty and supply chain security issues, too.
It does. Ensuring materials are sourced not just reliably, but also ethically and sustainably is becoming increasingly important for companies and for governments.
So a really complex picture on the ESG front.
Definitely. Lots to manage to ensure the transition is truly sustainable in all senses.
Well, this has certainly been a comprehensive deep dive. Let's try to quickly sum up the main takeaways for our listeners.
Sounds good.
Okay, so first off, BES is absolutely vital for making renewables work consistently and hitting those net zero targets. It's not optional, really.
Right. The market's growing incredibly fast, huge projections, but
But there are real challenges. Securing enough raw materials ethically and reliably is a big one.
yep. And then dealing with batteries at end of life, scaling up recycling is crucial. And managing all those ESG risks we just talked about.
Government policies like the IRA in the US and the EU's initiatives are massively important in driving investment and shaping the market.
Absolutely key. And technology is still evolving. Sodium ion looks promising as an alternative or complement to lithium ion.
And costs are coming down significantly, which is essential for BESS to compete, although maybe not quite there yet for all applications, especially long duration.
Exactly. Getting cheaper, but still needs to fall further for full fossil fuel substitution.
We hope drilling into these sources has given you, our listener, some valuable aha moments and a clearer picture of this really dynamic field without, hopefully, too much information overload.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it's incredibly important.
So to wrap up, here's a final thought for you to ponder. We've talked about energy, materials, geopolitics. They're all interconnected here. Thinking about that complex web, what unforeseen factors, maybe technological breakthroughs we haven't discussed, or unexpected geopolitical shifts, or even social acceptance issues might dramatically accelerate or perhaps seriously hinder the widespread adoption of battery energy storage in the coming decade.
It's a good question. Lots of potential unknowns out there.
It really makes you think about the broader context. We encourage you to keep exploring. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.